The focus on practices is about making the journey from conceptual and propositional knowledge to embodied experiential knowledge.
For me, part of the living practice is what I call tending the temple of self. So that is putting my individuality, that self that is my personality, my psychology, my temperaments, my predispositions, putting all of that in service of an opening understanding of a more expansive, inclusive, and whole self.
You potentially are never not in a practice opportunity. Every circumstance, every situation, every challenge is a practice opportunity. So much of Zone 4 work is orchestration and architecture work to facilitate the release of possibilities. Because the problem of the world in Zone 4 is we've developed this heavy bureaucratic weight. Everything sucks the life out of things. And we're looking in the transition from this epoch to the next to release, to liberate the natural creativity, the natural brilliance of individuals and teams and groups. And the release of that is going to have to be facilitated by the architecture that supports life.
Life is always calling itself forth into manifestation more and more through us. And so that kind of the big energy behind wanting to be expressed is life's. And that bit of us bringing ourselves into alignment, my individuality into alignment and service of something larger than myself, of life itself, is the part where you've just so masterfully laid out this menu of really powerful ways in. We can open any one of those doors and it will lead to all the other doors.
Welcome to Portals of Perception. Central to the Portals project is the cultivation of emergent practices. We are working and fostering living practices, ecologies of living practices, practices that facilitate development and encourage the evolution appearing with us humans at this time. The focus on practices is about making the journey from conceptual and propositional knowledge to embodied experiential knowledge. Practice is the bridge from an idea and a concept to embodied actualization. And these embodiment and experiential dimensions, they include, for example, the inner states and capacities that are foundational for anything we do and anything we may be able to reach for. While our Silicon Valley friends are working on building the metaverse, increasingly the risk for humanity, with all the technological advancement, is that we become disembodied, that we think we can just live in our heads and in our concepts. Because ultimately, living is not merely about conceiving concepts. It is about conceiving life and celebrating life. To survive and to develop and evolve as a species, we've got to make this next evolutionary leap as whole persons. We cannot appear in the future just as talking heads. Our feelings, our inner states and alignment, our character formation processes, our sentiments, presence, ways of being and doing are all essential as we endeavor to unlock the next hopeful horizons for humanity. A living practice is how we cultivate, update, and bring these to life. I'm here with Grace Boda, who visited with us on several Portals, conversations, and events before, and we're here to reflect on the importance of our living practices and to explore the four main practice zones and what they encompass. So let me begin by way of warming up into the space, Grace, and ask you about your sense of living practices. What does practice mean for you?
Mm. I'm particularly engaged, Aviv, with your phrase living practice, because I think that encapsulates much of what's changing for us in terms of how we practice, so that more and more my awareness and that of the people I work with is going to the moment by moment, how I live, how I make meaning, how I interact, how I am being in any situation, as opposed to a set of rigors and disciplines or things I do every morning at 6 a.m. or skills that I develop over time and put into strategic implementation. It's rather my being. What am I being? And so I'm really excited about your phrase, living practice.
And I would propose that the two, and you said to me before we turned the recording that like a couple of decades ago, we would be again indeed approaching this more in the idea of skill development. Mm-hmm. I'd propose that what you are framing there, these are not mutually exclusive ideas, rather these are different infrastructures. So skill building still have its own place. What you're describing is practice as a living practice, as a broader, more holistic, throughout whole person way of thinking, being, doing, collaborating, and becoming the full continuum. Am I getting correctly what you're describing?
That's really well said, Aviv. I love how you've said that. I would also say, for me, part of the living practice is what I call tending the temple of self. So that is putting my individuality, that self that is my personality, my psychology, my temperaments, my predispositions, putting all of that in service of an opening understanding of a more expansive, inclusive, and whole self. And so that you're right, that the skill development and putting my capacities to work in ways that are increasingly led by and expressions of a higher, more holistic self would be a great way to say it.
Well, so in the context of a living practice and also the invitation to mentor, to coach, to invite others into your practices, it would be fair to ask, and I think that's where we're heading in the first zone, but I'll just frame it and perhaps you're giving us an intro into this. What is it you actually do when you tend to your temple? Or another way to ask the same question is, how would you invite or coach somebody to become their own temple keeper or temple caretaker?
You know, much in alignment with what you're saying about how we are entering the new era, knowing ourselves as more full and whole beings, not just walking, talking heads, right? So part of tending the temple of self is learning to access and kind of be in right relationship with all the, I'm going to call them levels of self. So we have a physical, our body wisdom, innate body wisdom we can access in new ways. We have our energetic system. More and more leaders are coming to me saying, I'm suddenly awakening to all these subtle perceptions and I want to know how my energy system affects those around me. So there's that, learning to have that be in wise and effective, balanced influence. Very importantly, at this point in time, is our psychological system. So there's lots of work I do with people to transcend the perceived separations, using every judgment I make as a doorway into opening the door beyond those perceptions of separation and difference. And there's so much we can do with our mental construction. So there's very kind of tangible practices that I think might be a different, longer conversation around working with our psychological and mental constructions. There's practices also that I would call in the mental realm about, for example, meditation, things that bring us into contact with our fundamental consciousness beyond our busy intellect. So there's many of those kinds of practices. And for those who are open to and ready for it, more spiritual practices that access all the levels of our being and in essence, bring them into alignment with our most fundamentally authentic self. so that then we employ all those skills and capacities directed by the part of us that feels most authentic and holistic.
Well, that's beautiful, because you just offered us a trailer for everything we are going to explore, and the framing of the somatic, the physical, the biological, the energetic, the psychological, the mental, and the spiritual as part of the ecologies of practice that you can cultivate in your own temple, such that you become indeed the most attuned temple is really what we are moving into in zone 1. So let me bring up this, and we're going to use this, and I'm going to begin to talk through these one at a time. And you have already given us a trailer to the first one. And so just as we go through this, feel free to interject and overlay and add dimensions, because all we are trying to do here right now is to offer an aerial view of the terrain and sample few of the practices, and purely make an invitation that, as I said there in the opening, we are more than the concepts and the ideas. It is about the living embodiment of these practices. So the 4 zones of development, the 4 development zones. And so this first zone is where we focus on personal development, about what I want to be and what I want to become. And in your framing, what is the temple that I am is serving, and how can this temple become the greater, more expansive in capacity. And so the way I frame the question here in this space is, what practices enable me to grow, what practices enable me to evolve, to realize my connective and creative potential. And if I was to embrace the framing you offered, we will be simply saying, what are the practices that unlock the greatest capacity of the temple within? And sometime I'll talk about it as the conclave within, the many lives within. And so when I begin to think about this zone 1, and I say, okay, so what are some of the practices we will sample here? And I'm going to sample 6 spaces, some of them you already mentioned. And the idea is that a person can actually develop a whole cosmology of practices, and they can, for situational reasons, for proactive reasons, go deep on one space, on one practice, or approach them holistically and broadly. All approaches are right given the circumstance that a person finds themselves in. So the first one that I highlighted here are forgiveness and absolvement practices. The premise being, if I don't have a living process, a living practice around forgiveness and absolvement, then I'm not really very effective in any development endeavor. I'm pretty useless, because, and I mean this in the most foundational way, Grace, because unless I have a practice of forgiveness for myself first, then I am likely to catch myself up every other week with how stupid I was, or how foolish I was, or how inartful or not very skilled I was a week earlier or a month earlier. Very easy to get locked in the ruminations and the regrets of the gap, the delta that one is always alerted to when you are in the arena working with people, and when you expose yourself to the areas where you have outage. So many years ago, I framed for myself a definition around forgiveness, the idea of forgiveness as choosing to love the opportunity of today more than I love the pains and the struggles of yesterday. That's for me the opening, the heart opening, the space opening that comes with forgiveness and absolvement. And when we come to zone 2, where we talk about working with others in groups and communities and teams, forgiveness and absolvement with others is as foundational as it is in self. But I'm highlighting this as the first space here. And then the full range, the full spectrum of character formation, qualities, values, and virtue development. My role model in this space is Benjamin Franklin, who at an early age of 14 or 15 or 16 decided as a man of the Enlightenment that he wanted to become an exemplary character. And so he selected those 13 virtues. And given that he had his esoteric training, he said, what I will do is every week I will focus on one virtue. And you do the math, 13 virtues. So he would go through each of the virtues 4 times a year through each of the seasons, because 4 times 13 is 52, and you get to the 52 weeks of the year. And this was his way of making sure that there was an infrastructure, a program for the kind of idealized man that he wanted to be, and the idea that he was forever a work in progress towards this ideal, which was very much the mental model of, well, coming even earlier, if you like, from some of the Aristotelian messages, but and from Marcus Aurelius, but certainly into the Enlightenment. And I still feel that in my work and in my way of showing up in the world, there were many times where I would say, today, in this experience, perhaps you have to, whatever you do in the arena with people, deep inside you, work on patience, or work on flexibility, or work on resilience, or work on being more present, or work on any virtue or any element that you feel is an area where you'd want to refine and upgrade your character or your operating system. Perhaps it is your readiness to trust the living process and its intelligence. So that's the second space I'll highlight here. Do you want to make any comment on these first 2, or shall I run through the other 4?
I'm just beaming over here. I mean, clearly you and I, we haven't talked through this in advance, and I'm just beyond delighted to see some of these showing up. Forgiveness is one of the starting places for me when I work with people, because, and so I'm so happy to see it here in what you're highlighting, because something that you're alluding to, it ties everything together here. I cannot judge and separate myself from another without also having judged and separated myself from my own being, from myself. And there's so much, I think, packed in there in how we understand the other 3. So I won't confuse us with that now, but how I view forgiveness, what I think forgiveness is, or what I think the resolution of a perceived harm is so dependent on and influenced by how I understand who and what I am, and who and what you are and we are together, and what reality I see. So I think that forgiveness piece and absolvement is core to all of the other boxes as well, and into how we understand ourselves. So I won't add to it except to say I'm just delighted to see that that's your starting point.
Another framing for forgiveness is surrendering the desire of better pasts,
Yes.
but rather accepting the emergence of what becomes possible here and now.
Yes, that's beautiful.
The third space is centering, balancing, and regulation practices. So much of what you already described there in the idea of tending to the temple, the physical, the energetic, the sense of, am I a little off center, and why? Am I running another software up in the background that's actually parasitic and takes some of my energy and attention? And if yes, why? And so many practices that, for those of us that perhaps been in this space for many years, you do these more as unconscious competence. It's there in the background, and yet still with it, I find that time and again, I bring back the consciousness. No, I don't take it for granted. I need to now engage with the practice of centering. I do not run any moment that's important, any engagement, any conversation, any focusing effort on autopilot. So therefore, where am I right now in my own centering, and how balanced I am or not, and what might I need to do right now to better regulate? And these lead to, again, what you suggested, the place of contemplation and the place of meditation, and the different applications of meditative and contemplative practices. Contemplative practices, in my framing, often a way to engage the broader space and reach to mid and deep space. Meditation often more in the dwelling, in the nearby space. And there is a different modalities that I bring to these. And sometimes they're on their own, and sometimes they are as part and integrated to centering, balancing, and regulation practices. And then the next two spaces, which you already spoke to, is this sense of know thyself. Remembering that we are forever continuing to discover who we are. Again, in your framing, discover the many chambers within the temple that we are. And also continuing to be reflective on what am I like in terms of what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses, and what are my activation points, and what are areas that I never paid attention to, but I'm now called to pay attention to. This idea that I am a work in progress, and I continue to refine myself by way of being a better tool, a better vessel, a better temple, and that therefore there is forever work for me to learn, to appreciate and understand the temple that I am, to know thy temple, such that I become a better tool for myself. And so much of that then gets expressed in the various practices of attunement, alignment, and higher states. And specifically self-alignment and self-attunement practices, they often come online in relation to what I might be called to do in zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, because depending on the situational configuration, the effort, the endeavor that I need to engage in, it's different whether I'm going to spend a day with my family or whether I'm going to spend a day leading a group of 12 people or a group of 100 people through an intense process. So how might I calibrate myself and align myself to those different opportunities and spaces? I find that this is where we begin. So I'm not surprised you naturally talked about tending to the temple within as the first space, because without that zone 1 and a robust ecologies of practice in this personal temple zone, we really cannot talk about meaningfully about zone 2, zone 3, and zone 4, because we will see as we come into zone 2, zone 3, and zone 4, zone 1 continues to work inside any of the other zones as you explore the developmental work and the practice, the living practices in each of these spaces.
Yes, absolutely. I'm finding it helpful that you're helping us kind of think in distinct but interrelated ways about these four zones, and also acknowledging they co-arise and interpenetrate one another. And so there's some way that none of them ever functions without affecting all of the others or being embedded in all of the others. But I'm finding it useful, Aviv, and I'm really glad you brought this structure to help us see the four different zones.
Couple of weeks ago, we ran a 3-day weekend, full day weekend with a group of nearly 200 people, and one of the practices we focused on, which is not framed here but relates to higher states, was about building increasing inner conductivity. And what might you do to build increasing inner conductivity? Now, there is no point to talk about increasing inner conductivity before you've done centering work, balancing work, and regulation work. Because if you increase conductivity in a place that's not centered and regulated, it's dangerous or even explosive. But then what we sensed into and explored was how when you connect different modalities and different frameworks and different inner capacities, and you bring them online in the synchronicity or the spontaneity of activation of several systems all at the same time, you are literally, instead of viewing yourself as one planet or even as one star, you activate in yourself, in metaphoric terms, a configuration, like a galaxy of possibilities. And because of the permutation, that by itself unlocks and liberates tremendous conductivity. And when you do that, you actually, what you do, you increase your space. Mm-hmm. And the awareness that we surfaced there was the criticality of, because we live now inside this never-ending cacophonous noise, and life is so crowded, central to the work of tending to the temple within is space making. Mm-hmm. Presence-full space making. And this practice of increasing the inner conductivity, thereby increasing the space, thereby increasing your capacity to handle multiplicities and not be pressured to be reactive. It's one of the ways to transcend polarities. How do we transcend polarities? There are all sorts of moves. There is the integration move, there is the third vector moves, there are other moves, seeing two ends as a manifestation of a continuum. But the move I'm describing now of escaping polarities is the move of dramatically increasing the space that you occupy. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking of yourself as a small room, viewing yourself as a huge temple, not a small temple. Mm-hmm. So all of those will be in zone one, and some of what I'm highlighting now are specifically zone one practices as you move to make yourself ready and attuned to be in service in zone two. So zone two is where we focus on collective or communal or co-creative development, who we want to be as a team, as a group, as an organization, as a network, ad hoc or committed for the long journey, whatever the situation is. Who do we want to be? Who do we want to become? And yes.
Oh, I was just thinking that, as we run higher, I'll say energetics through our system in whatever way, and as we hold an even larger space and as we transmit even more powerfully, we can't help but activate everyone we're connected to and all through us, all the systems that we participate in. So I'm just acknowledging that there is the who do we want to become and be together, and there is also the inevitability that we become something different every time any one of us activates ourselves in our vastness and our majesty in a bigger way. So again, I'm just pointing to the interlocking inseparability of these processes.
It's a beautiful awareness. The essence of what you said there is, if you do the work in zone 1 in the fullest, most robust way, you reach a point where you cannot but irradiate and impact and play in all 3 zones. And that is also true in the monastic belief that if you are an enlightened being somewhere by yourself on a mountain, metaphorically on the mountain or in your life, you are impacting the broader ecology that you operate in, and certainly all the people that you are connected to. I have chosen deliberately to live in life, to not be in the retreat from life. I equally uphold the conviction and the belief that there may be a very special people all around the planet who are perhaps more living a monastic or a secluded or contained life, and they nevertheless gift the world with their presence without us knowing about them. And perhaps our capacity to sometimes transcend whatever we struggle with is enhanced, is uplifted by the work that they do. So you also in this awareness invite here the recognition that we may be speaking about this here through one lens or set of lenses and frameworks. There are people all around the planet who do this kind of work in individual settings, in cells, in pods, in crews, in teams, in larger communities. And we are all on the bridge from where we have reached to at this point through the gold and silver gate bridge to a new future where a new dawn, a new epoch, a new transitional developmental and evolutionary process is underway. So the context for me in exploring these zones of practice is absolutely in the bigger picture related to this and is inclusive of all the many people that are practitioners of whatever area of practice, living practices that they choose to focus on.
Absolutely. And I would underline as well that not just those enlightened monks up on a mountaintop somewhere, but every one of us, when we do work in consciousness and clear a boulder from our own, a belief system or a limitation or an erroneous perception from our own system, because we are inseparable, we're nowhere near as distinct as we think we are, but because we're all participating in a unified field together, every time I move that in myself, I make it more possible for someone else who I may never even have spoken to or had contact with. Maybe someone connected to me in some way. It becomes easier for everyone every time any one of us does that. So there is I love that you're pointing to, and I'm eager to see what your practices will be, but there is a collective aspect and benefit to the individual work that we do.
Right. So again, to just stay with this very important point you made, when I release a blockage or what I call a stop situation, 5 other people on the other side of the planet wake up and get alerted to, because for one reason or another, what we released in ourselves, they were grappling with in their way, and we're on the same wavelength, and they discover all of a sudden a resource point or an access that was not available for them a moment earlier. So let's look at the 6 spaces, again, just really sampling in zone 2. So yeah, what practices enable us to grow, to evolve, to liberate as a collective, as a connective, as a co-creative, as a communal endeavor? as a mutualized endeavor. I've started to use more the term mutualized than collective.
I like that.
And so I started here with practices with listening and presencing, because we begin by being present to ourselves and then being present to the other people that are with us, and listening and obviously observing. So that's really, there are so many practices that come into this, but the foundational way of stepping back in ourselves to open this space here, the solar plexus area, or the whole area that we occupy, such that we listen, not just with our ears and not just with a cerebral process, but in the whole person listening, or what we often describe as listening with presence. And then the resolving conflict and the finding coherence practices, many different. I'm using this as a placeholder, as a way to name all the many practices we engage in when we find differences, when we find divergent processes and needs and requirements and desires, and when we reach to enlarge the space and integrate those different needs and requirements, and if and when there are conflicts, to find a way to integrate these as well. And then the various practices we engage in finding the point of coherence, including the capacity to hold discordance and what may appear as incoherent, but is actually part of the coherence of the space that we occupy. I know that's a big part of the work you do. You may want to make a comment on this now, or should I bring the next spaces first?
You bring the practices in, and I imagine there'll be some underlying themes.
Okay, well, so I've chosen to highlight here rituals and ceremonies. And I really mean by that all the meaning-making, significance-making celebrations that we bring to the collective or the mutualized spaces. As simple as something just happened. Somebody just said something that was painful or was inspirational, and we pause with it to celebrate the insight or the information that it brings to us, all the way to more deliberate, chosen, choreographed, and specially cultivated with intention ceremonies at different stages of life. And in my community, we practice all the way from those ceremonies that you celebrate with a new life that has appeared here, all the way through the different stages of life, through to the time we leave this form, this physical form, and there is the ceremonies that accompany and facilitate and ease that transition too. So just the recognition that we really are here stewards of life. And part of what we do with each other and the way we serve each other in our relationships, in our families, in our communities, is in the stories we tell, in the memories we create and celebrate, and the tremendous significance of rituals and ceremonies in that. And then how inside it all we sometimes spontaneously and a lot of the time intentionally and deliberately engage in practices that will invite the intelligence of the group, the intelligence of the collective field, or the intelligence of the connective field, which is beyond the people that are part of that group. And again, the more detailed practices that go with that and how it relates to listening and presencing, and the way of being and enabling the emergent wisdom of a group of people to inform and guide our processes. And then I added the various facilitation know-how and what we call here cover generation. And by cover generation, I mean the many efforts we sometimes will engage in even before we actually meet with a group. I will sometimes spend hours, days in concentrated contemplation about the journey I'm about to travel with a group of people, so that I can mentally, spiritually experience some of the challenges on that journey, so that in advance I can disarm some of the explosive moments, not to take away from people their struggle, but that's how I see myself in the capacity of a facilitator or a Sherpa up a mountain journey. The cover generation is to travel the path in advance to the degree that you can. When you choose, sometimes you'll choose not to do so, but when you can and when you choose to, and be in a way maternal, sometimes paternal, but also maternal for the group. Become in yourself and in your own process, in your zone 1 in service of zone 2. Become a womb for the success and the liberation and the breakthrough moments of others. These are spaces that I've talked very little about over the last 40 years, but if we are to take the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, I probably have good 20, 30, 40,000 hours of being in my entire adult life centered in these practices, even before I knew what I was doing. It was in the first place very early in life, just more intuitive, and it became then a deliberate set of practices. And then how these and other modalities will serve to liberate the creativity and the expression, and especially when we are with groups of people and we wish to transcend or escape the dominance of words and language, to make space for music, for the somatic, the dance, the movement, the gesture, for other artistic expressions, including poetry, which is again with words, essentially liberating the larger range available for us to express intelligence, to express feelings and sentiments, to celebrate together the meaning and the connection and the significance that we feel together. So what would you say, what comes alive in you when I describe this space from your experience, or anything that you'd contribute here?
It's full articulation of even, I'm not surprised to hear about your 30, 40,000 hours of, your mastery in sector 1 leads naturally into that kind of attention to sector 2. Something that I would say in this, I like the mutualizing space language too, is that I think you're speaking to, is when we've tended our temple of self and come to know ourselves more and more, we begin to learn, as you were alluding to, that by doing the work internally in myself, by recognizing the fractal nature of being, that whatever consciousness I see out there also lives in me. So rather than thinking, oh, that problem that's happening over there with those people, how will I help them fix that? Instead, I can recognize the consciousness that interpenetrates all levels also lives in me. So I can begin by doing that work in myself. I can ask myself, how does that live in me? It might be a different scale or focus or whatever, but it lives somewhere in me because all of humanity lives in me. And so I can do that work in myself first. And by doing that, I ease the way for that work to happen at another level, of the fractal, the collective I might be working with, or the larger world. I hear you alluding to that, and also to the way that then, having done this work and supported it to unravel and unfold and open up at all the levels of being, individually, relationally, collectively, nationally, galactically, in all the ways. Then we also anchor and bring it. So there's that reverse movement then of anchoring it, bringing it down into the body and into lived practice. So I love that you included ritual and ceremony. So I think of ceremony as a third level of how we activate and energize something. So the first way is with our attention, just by paying attention to it. I give it energy. I start activating and amplifying a reality. And then when I bring intention, my focused attention to it, I activate it with even more power. If I then ritualize or ceremonialize that, I bring my body and my being into it. I make some ritual action as simple as handing someone a gift, or, it could be, doesn't have to be, complicated, but just by embodying it in a way, I empower and amplify and strengthen it even more. So I love that you're alluding to all of these in ways that also permeate my work as well. I may have articulated them differently, and I'm finding so much value in bringing together the way that you're thinking and articulating them with mine. I would also add, in addition to other roles, I also am a mediator, so I've done a lot of work in conflict resolution. And something interesting I've been seeing in the last couple of years, especially with the leaders I work with, is less often than, it still happens, how do I resolve this difficulty or this conflict with someone? But even more often, what I'm finding is people saying, what's the best way for me to help? And so we end up needing to clean up the interpersonals or the leadership of a collective that's about how am I helpful? And by clean up, I mean helping people to remember, not only am I sovereign in my being, but everyone else is too. And so how do I give the dignity to the person's journey and experience that they are creating? How do I recognize the creation that they are and then help or support? So by giving dignity, I mean recognizing there is an inherent evolution in them that only needs to have the barriers removed and to be supported to unfold. It doesn't need me to do it for them. And that takes away some of the dignity. So how do I ennoble rather than enable what's happening around me? More and more leaders I'm noticing are paying more attention to how can I be a healing, restorative, balancing presence in a system that already innately knows its way back to balance, rather than how do I go in as the person in charge and fix that thing that's broken over there? So I'm really, I think that's an important part of our next stages.
Indeed. So let me try and capture or say back to you the three things that I've heard in what you said there. First, you didn't use the term, but there was in what you were offering this idea, this awareness, that there is shadow work that we can do in zone 1.
Absolutely.
Shadow work and light work. And there is shadow work and light work that we do in zone 2, where we attend to those shadow elements in the group, in the collective. And some of what you just addressed in the last point you made about the cleanup work is a full cycle inside it. And what is so special and profound in that last comment you offered was you're describing the work of a healer or the work of a priest when they no longer need to be center stage. They may do the work off stage without them needing to be seen to be doing the work, thereby not only helping the physical, biological, energetic restoration of another person, but also attending to the psychological need of the other person to retain their dignity. And there is an interesting dance there, because you want to empower the person, and they sometimes need to know that you're working on their behalf, but they need to also know that you're not taking from them the opportunity of the work they must do for themselves. And the other piece you offered in the middle was, you framed perhaps the three steps from the temple, the individual temple, to the mutualized temple, through attention, intention, and celebration and ritual. Because when we celebrate and ceremonize, we are creating the temple or the cathedral of our mutualized field, and what that means for us, because what we are actually describing. And what you said in the first place, when you talked about tending to the temple within, you said, you know what, the temples of the future, they are the human temple. No longer do we make pilgrimage to temples of outside of ourselves. We now make pilgrimage to the temples within, and we make pilgrimage to the mutualized cathedrals that we together create in our shared intention and endeavor of purpose. Which leads me now to zone 3. And zone 3 is often where we actually begin. Well, we begin in zone 1, because you can't do zone 3 work without being a person. And yet, the search for truth, the search to see what is, the search to perceive what the case actually is so critical, because if we stay in the subjective space in the individual or the collective, we may be susceptible to intersubjective psychobubble, super drama that sometime will be generated in these spaces. And so there is a certain, if we talked in zone 1 about regulation, part of the regulation is being tethered in practices that enable us to see the bigger picture, to see what the truth is, to see what reality looks like, whatever are the different dimensions and levels of reality. So here, the guiding inquiry is, what practices offer access to seeing and perceiving life as it is, and embracing its truth, its reality, and its potential. And different traditions and different disciplines and different wisdom practices will come at this from different avenues. I have chosen to highlight, again, sample just 6 spaces here, and here they are. So, yes, the capacity to bring analytical and critical thinking and processing, and the practices to ground whatever we're dealing with, whatever we're looking at, in terms of logic and natural logic. And for me, logic is not just the narrower definition of logic, but the logic of life, the logic of the tree. The law of the tree for me is that the tree grows from its roots, not from the roots of any other tree. Although all the root system is connected in the floor of the forest, where one tree can help another tree. So right there is the logic of the forest and the law of the forest. And I can apply that logic in the way I look at problems, at relational problems, at political problems, at geopolitical problems, at organizational issues, at whatever scientific or philosophical or theological inquiry we bring to bear. I seek to engage natural logic as part of the practices. What can we learn from the law of the forest and the law of the tree, or from the process of the caterpillar and its journey to become butterflies? Because these natural processes and the process of the seasons, they offer me not some 16th century or even ancient wisdom. They offer me eternal wisdom that was there perennially before any philosopher and will be there after we're gone. Although obviously many of the wisest philosophers we celebrate were attentive to that same inquiry, I find that in my search for truth, alongside the study of the great thinkers and the great philosophers, I needed to travel back to the first church, which was the Church of Nature, and study the natural worlds and discover logic through there, and bring into it this idea of first principle thinking. And first principle thinking is the practice of looking at anything, any situation, any problem, any opportunity, any dynamic, and looking to inquire what is the essence of this situation, or what is the first principle of that opportunity, and what are the important but nevertheless accompanying or environmental factors rather than the first principle. And yes, we can bring into it the awareness that everything is connected to everything else. And still I will ask, when you look at this particular situation, what is the first principle? This is something we do at home with my wife. There is a problem, there is a challenge, there is a crisis, and I ask, what's the first principle of this situation? And sometimes the first principle, if there is a life endangering situation, is to alleviate that risk right there and then. But if there isn't that kind of an emergency, and we can step back and think about what is the first principle, developing a practice of thought around that is very grounding and very helpful. And then inside it, using all the various observational, visualization, and perception skills and practices, natural worlds and beyond that, and working with people, I've learned to observe and listen and perceive not just the obvious but the subtle, and I've learned to listen to not just to the subtle but to the invisible realms that get activated, because the search for truth, in the way I frame here this third zone, is beyond the framing of the, say, 400 years of the scientific revolution that grounded us in the empirical paradigm, which is wonderful because it unlocked so much for us, grace, but in a way left us bereft of the other ways of coming to know and coming to access truth, which is why I highlighted here this capacity to connect the dots through your intuitive processes, through your subtle ways of knowing, and engage other practices of divination and insight generation, all in the quest that if I am to be effective with myself in zone 1, if I am to be effective with others in my family, my community, in the larger network that I serve, if I am to be effective with those systems, I have to have a way to ground myself in something that's more than my subjective experience, and is as broadly encompassing of the different dimensions of that reality, of that picture, of that situation, such that I can serve it in the best possible way. So, of all the practices that I use, the inquiry prodding practices may be one of the most central ones so much of the work I do with leadership teams in the corporate space around strategy and helping them unlock their potential is asking them questions. I used to, wittingly say, jokingly, but wittingly say that I get paid the big checks for the questions I ask, not for the answers I give. And at some point, I stopped even joking about it because I realized truly that is where the unlock power was when you are with yourself, when you're with people. Can we ask a question? Can we frame an inquiry that by itself will expand not just the box, but the sandbox that we play in, and will expose us to permutations, possibilities we didn't see before. And system mapping, well, right now what I'm doing here is system mapping and loom processing. I'm demonstrating the idea of building a loom of processes and how, as you said, assistive that can be in terms of building distinctions and then integrating and connecting these ecologies of practice. So what would you say to this zone 3, the search for truth?
Something I'm appreciating is there is so much overlap, Aviv, in how you and I view things and the practices we're discovering we have been investing in ourselves, and some distinctions in how we each, just in terms of our own consciousness and styles and ways of articulating our understanding, might express it. So here's one where I see, I too have been really attentive to, for myself and with people I work with, the wholeness of learning to observe and make meaning through our intuitive and subtler senses, as well as our rational, logical, ordering, sequencing kind of senses. And one of the things that has been coming up recently, so I'm going to bring it down into a kind of the practicality bit. One thing that's been coming up recently, as people that I work with in particular are, especially people who have lived much in their heads and are now kind of expanding through practices, through a lot of work in zone 1, learning, oh, I'm a more whole being than this. I actually gain information. I get fresh insights. My mind oftentimes is referencing the past and associations and things that worked before, and I'm getting fresher insights through my intuitive, direct experience kind of knowing. But then it's important for people to learn how to distinguish what's the difference between fantasy, projection, and true intuitive knowing. So I think there's a skill development. Here's the skill part of developing a new relationship with ways of knowing that some people aren't very practiced in, maybe have spent their whole life kind of, in their left brain. So learning to kind of use our meaning making and sensing and observational skills more holistically has kind of a skill development aspect to it, as well as an ordering. And I don't know, I wonder if you'll see it the same way. I oftentimes think about an ordering that in terms of receiving intuitive information, and here's another skill piece, like how to interact with symbolic. Sometimes there's a symbolic language to our intuitive information. So receiving in that way, and then using our analytical rational mind to help us collect data and make associations and plans and sequence things and enact and embody what we've done. So kind of something that comes from me here is, as we search for truth with more and more of our sensing and meaning making systems, there's some skill development some of us have to invest in. So first, before I go on, why don't I ask, what do you see? Do you see this kind of ordering of receiving through one mind and enacting through another, or how do you see that?
Well, so yes and yes and yes. First yes is, yes, zone 3 is the zone of sense making and meaning making. Mm-hmm. The second yes is that they work in not one sequence, but in all sequences. Sometime the somatic awareness will lead the cognitive, and sometime the intuitive will lead the somatic, the feeling, the sense. And so we work I view the human system, I experience the human system as a shape-shifting, hologramic intelligence, a bit like a swarming birds. They shapeshift, and we too, depending on the ecology and the task at hand, different intelligences in our system will lead first. So that's the second yes. And the third yes that was implicit in what you offered was that we do the work in zone 3, both through zone 1 and through zone 2. Mm-hmm. So we do the sense making in ourselves. We've got to be tethered in ourselves. And then how critical it is to test it with others, to make sure we are not building some fantasy that's divorced from reality. This is where journey friends, practitioner friends, building pods of practice in variety of those spaces. These are so very important because they offer corroboration. It doesn't mean we all need to perceive in the same way. I work with people, Grace, where the first faculty and medium they use is drawing. So we may be in an exploration and they let themselves with colors and paint to draw, and they don't even know what they're drawing, but they let that process lead, and then they look at what they're drawing and they find the meaning in it.
That's beautiful.
Which is different to, I have a meaning, I have a concept, and now I will come to draw. Now, that's not my way. I don't have that facility. And I'm equally inspired by that we would be in the middle of an inquiry with a group, and we'll put on the screen a contemplation or an inquiry. And one of our community friends will respond by playing music. And the music they're able to compose live in the moment that they are moved by is another pathway into the truth of the moment.
Yes.
And because they have the facility and the conduit of accessing the potential of the moment through music, they offer the rest of us access to meaning we wouldn't otherwise be able to access by way of feeling and intuition and so on. So this is where zone 3 is so much richer, when we bring the diversity of our talents and our process inclinations and configuration. This is really where the potential of the mutualized endeavor creates so many dividends, and then we're not really creating ceremonies to create a ceremony. We are literally celebrating the emergence of life and intelligence and truth. And you could say that we are co-creating what's emerging. And so this is truly where zone 3 becomes zone 4. Zone 3 becomes zone 4 when the search for truth becomes the act of co-creation, where we shape the ecology, where we impact what we create around us in the environment, in the mutualized environment, and thereby we shape or influence or inspire the world, whatever the verb that we would feel more comfortable with. And here, but first, did I answer your question there?
Before we go all the way off of, I'm going to go right where you're going. We're in sync with this. I'm seeing the transition into 4. I wanted to also say a little bit more about, I'm also connecting now in your illustration here, how the work done in zones 1 and 2, what you've called shadow work, or we both talked about it as forgiveness or releasing, transcending judgments and perceived separations and all of that. So how some of that work influences the search for truth, because what we begin to see as truth is that the world, I'm not a victim of the world, that my life is not happening to me, that I am creating and co-creating. the life and the world as it is outpictured around me. And the more that I release my judgments and engage in authentic forgiveness practices, and the more that in zone 2, I'm seeing you and me and you, so that starts to break down, the more is available to me in terms of searching for truth, of really seeing what is as it is, rather than seeing my undigested material projected out onto the world. So I'm seeing all of that. And also as I begin in zone 1, knowing more and more who I am and who we are in zone 2, and beginning to own more and more of the creativity of the unitary consciousness we all participate in, that source of being that's constantly giving rise to the experiences that we have, then this is going to take us into 4. So that's where I'm seeing the search for truth in zone 1 and 2. The truth begins to become clear of our participation in the unitary creative source of being, which then takes us into zone 4 in such a different way than we might have been had we not yet come to that.
So again, yes and yes and yes, to retrace in what you offered. If I experienced something very painful when I was 12 or 13, and that got frozen in time, mm-hmm. then I have not been able to integrate that to that part. It's like there is a locked door in the temple, in my temple. Mm-hmm. Once I'm able to metabolize that experience and release that frozen door, I now see a bigger part, I now experience a bigger part of my temple, and therefore I can see a truth that I couldn't see before. Equally, in my case, I was born and raised in a kibbutz in Israel, so there is the collective shadow and the wonderful benefits of that, but there are also the biases that I had to metabolize and work through so that I could transcend these and integrate them as part of how I see the world, to be able to see indeed the larger, broader truth. So you're absolutely right. To do the work of zone 3, I have to do the work of zone 1 and 2, and yet to do the work of zone 1 and 2, I have to bring a passion for zone 3 inquiry in both. And when I integrate those 3 propulsions, they naturally lead where you started, which is when you do the work inside, you cannot but begin to inquire, how can we liberate and express our greatest transformational capacities and unlock the kind of sustainable and regenerative futures and scenarios and outcomes and impact that we can create. So what are those practices that will unlock and liberate the healthiest, most robust opportunities for all? And so, I mean, we could spend, and we ought to come back, but again, I just sampled 6 spaces as the appetizer into this zone 4. And where I started was, naturally, some of us, we choose to show up in the world as teachers, as coaches, as mentors, but I focus not on the role of the teacher, the coach, the mentor, but on the process, because we're always in one way or another learning and teaching, learning and coaching, being mentored and mentoring all at the same time, including with the people that we teach and coach. So that's a natural place to begin. And then I said, let's bring into this the recognition that so much of the work we do is about setting ecologies in which individuals and groups can grow and bloom and flourish. And so much of the work that I find that I do is about setting infrastructures. That's what I talked about when you do the preparatory work, the invisible work, and sometimes when you do the work together with others to establish the scaffoldings that are necessary before something else can happen. It's the work we do before the work can begin. It's the journey we embark on before the journey can begin. All that is what I describe in building infrastructure. And this conviction, Grace, that we never are not working inside an ecology. We are either working in ecologies that we carefully engendered and cultivated with care, with love, with devotion, with passion, or we are in an ecology that's uncared for and is fractured and fragmented, and therefore we cannot facilitate the most optimal kind of experiences in those. And I mean, life happens, and you often find yourself in the moment without something that you could perhaps prepare for hours. But then the work I find, often when I'm presented with a question or with a need, my first work is not to respond to the question, not to respond to the need. My first work is, what is the ecology I need to create such that we can address that need, such that we can approach that question. That is how I'm wired in my work. So ecology setting is very foundational. And that then leads to governance and policy practices and to scaling. Because so teaching, coaching, mentoring, ecology setting, that's a lot of the smaller scale, one on few in groups. But what are we going to do when we want to create larger scale impact in the world? How do we work as larger organizations where the network, the organization, has a life of its own, but not a consciousness of its own? It has a life of its own, but not a consciousness of its own. So what are the practices? What are the protocols? What are the living processes that we build into those systems such that they are as humane and as friendly and as supportive? Because so much of what we struggle with in the world today, you could describe the meta crisis as a world where all the systems and the structures developed by the modern project of the last several centuries reached a point that they forgot to remember that they were built to support life and facilitate life. And the education system, the healthcare system, the financial system, the system of law, all those systems, they became divorced from serving life and serving people. And they became systems of power where you have the people in the middle of those systems that in a recursive way build more power. And more often than not, it's not because there was malice or bad intent, but it's how the system is captured by its own lack of consciousness. So how will we build systems and governance and policy practices that forever are in service of transformation and accelerate transformation? And finally, what I sampled here, inside it all, how do we make decisions? How do we develop strategies? And there isn't just one way to make decisions. There are several ways to make decisions. And situationally, we need to choose, given the circumstance and the need, what is the best modality for decision making. It's not one size or one approach or one modality fits all. And then finally, which is similar but adjacent to the infrastructure, it's this idea of system and process design and engineering. So much of the work that I do in Zone 2 is a dedicated meditative effort, the nature of which is system design and process design. How do I choreograph the experience? I want to facilitate a breakthrough for a team. I imagine I'm taking them on a 3-day journey. I know they need to feel a certain success by the afternoon of day 2, or else they will be anxious about where will they live on day 3. So what do I need to seed on the second morning? But how do I get to seed this with them on the second morning is shaped by where I have arrived with them in the completion of day 1. But where I arrived with them in the completion of day 1 is defined by what I was able to do with them in the first 90 minutes. So process choreography, experience choreography, facilitating transformation, facilitating discovery is so important. How do we do this on scale? How do we enable these processes? And now we come back full circle to what you framed earlier, this delicious conundrum. How do we do this when we are not in the system? How do we facilitate this so it's not dependent on us? Very difficult challenge. Very difficult challenge. So these are some practices. So the one word I don't see here that I would add now, because this morning I sat together and I said, this is coming on me that we're going to do this with grace. So this is just a couple of hours ago. The other word I would add to this last one, it's system and process design and architecture. So much of Zone 4 work is orchestration and architecture work to facilitate the release of possibilities. Because the problem of the world in Zone 4 is we've developed this heavy bureaucratic weight. Everything sucks the life out of things. And we are looking in the transition from this epoch to the next to release, to liberate the natural creativity, the natural brilliance of individuals and teams and groups. And the release of that is going to have to be facilitated by the architecture that supports life. What is that? How do we enable that? How do we build that architecture in the spaces we live in, and in even the virtual spaces where we share our inquiry and conversation? So that's what I got to in Zone 4. What would you bring to this space?
Yeah, I think I will. This is very comprehensive. I think I'm going to bring in it's not additional, but maybe more of an interpenetrating perspective. So often I hear people, when they want to talk about impacting the world, thinking of the world as this thing out there that I need to go, like, maybe this is the way to say it. I recognize that the world, or the circumstances we want to impact, are the effects of a source that lives in consciousness. That the world, the circumstances we see are downstream from the source of their creation, which lives in all of us, individually and collectively. So I think there's been a really important realization more often in recent years that we can keep messing with the effects all the time and trying to fix the effects all the time. But if we don't go to the source of those effects, they'll just pop up. The same problem will pop up somewhere else. So people are looking further upstream to what is the thinking, the mindset, the understanding, the meaning that had us create that effect. And so, not to say that we only live in our meaning making and never do anything practical with the world, but saying that we start with what was the source of this expression, this effect. And so how do we start in consciousness and then align our new systems and policies and all of that with our new understanding? That's happening so fast that one of the other perspectives that I bring in, and I think you do too, is about complexity, how we move with complexity in circumstances where we can no longer assume that A leads to B leads to C, just like it always has. Instead, there's multiple factors doing unpredictable things. So we have to practice completely new ways of sensing and adapting and working. So that's kind of a how of doing these. And then the third thing that I would bring in is this new and burgeoning understanding of how human systems, so I mean now human systems, the dynamics, so that, for example, in a human system, a workforce or a society or whatever it is, you can't just replace a part that isn't working. You know, you can't, it's defined by the unit of analysis is relationship. It's how things interact with each other. So we have to look at all the interactions and the dynamics of a system that, while not conscious itself, it evokes and recreates something that it is designed to do unless we change the interactions within it. So learning how systems work, human systems work, learning to move and work differently and plan differently in complexity, and taking responsibility for the source of the problem before we just keep trying to fix the manifestations of it, I think are underlying understandings to all of what you're talking about. It's probably part of your infrastructures and ecology setting maybe as well, but I see those as kind of undergirding how we go about making all the changes that you're talking about here.
Yes, and yes, and yes again, because you also intuited the next the fifth dimension, which overlays that when you talk about souls. Because having looked at those 4 zones of practice, and I do believe that it's important for us in the facilitation of what's emerging now and what's trying to emerge, that we can build distinction and that we can go deep on first principle thinking. What do we mean by that? Or that we can choose to do a full workshop, a full couple-day workshop on ecology setting. What is that? What are the practices? What are the arts? What are the technologies of ecology setting, and bring a focused experience around that, or spend a weekend around designing and creating rituals and ceremonies in your life. So there is here endless space to cultivate and go deep with that, to encompass this holistic picture. The one additional dimension that I propose is that first we need to bring leadership to each of those spaces, because we forever are leading ourselves, we forever are leading the mutualized spaces, we forever are pathfinding and leading the search for truth and sense making and meaning making, and we forever are leading from inside out, as you said, the world, because the world doesn't begin out there, the world begins inside here. And then when we do so, we realize that truly the deeper way to describe leadership in this is to recognize that we are truly talking about the emanatory realms, the blessing realms of presence, and that the soil from which, the ground from which all of this is emerging, and or what encompasses all of that is and we can talk about this in variety of different ways. What is important for me to say, and it's easy to say this with you, it is also important that it is still part of this exploration. When we talk about the emanatory realms, the blessing realms of presence, it is as concrete and as real for me as the desk in front of me. It's as tangible and as sensed and felt and recognized, tested and validated in 4 decades of journey, increasingly coming to recognize that the meta-crisis of this moment in time is that what these spaces represent, all the spaces we are seeing, when you divorce them from a living practice, when you divorce logic from a living practice and you look at it in the way it has been calcified, when you divorce the systems that govern the governance and the engineering and the strategy, when you divorce these spaces, and even when you divorce psychological configuration in horizon, in zone one, if you divorce these from living practice and therefore divorce them from presence, we are seeing the description, the map of the crisis points. And the map of those crisis points, they together describe the convergence point represents the meta-crisis. And that's why I say that the meta-crisis emanates out of the broader crisis of the spirit, which is another way of saying humanity has been running on empty for too long. And the project of this time, the project of easing this next epochal transition and bringing to life what awaits us on the other side of the bridge through all these many living practices is engaging with source, engaging with the blessing realms, bringing living presence as the substance, the currency of everything we do, and that in itself is an invitation to forever be in the bigger practice of life-giving, presence-making flow practices, whatever way you engage with these. And to me, you started to describe this right at the beginning when you talked about tending to the temple within. And practically each of the practice space we explored has as its inner thread that I do the know thyself, that I do the character formation, that I do the listening and presencing, that I do the rituals and the ceremonies and the resolving conflicts, that I do the system mapping and the inquiry prodding, that I do this tethered to presence in myself, tethered to that other greater creative source that is at the soil of everything and emanates and is emanating through life. That is the invitation I bring to this idea of the ecologies of practice in those four zones with this fifth elusive dimension.
Aviv, it's such a beautiful bringing us full circle into the wholeness of it, because what even the visual calls forward for me is the awareness that, well, we've just spent our time elucidating practices, ways that we tend the temple of ourselves and collectively, individually. So these are all things we can do in order to access these blessing realms and bring them through us. But the way that you've orchestrated the visual just calls to mind the paradoxical simultaneous truth that there's nothing we need to do, that the blessing realms of presence are ever present, always desiring and ready and available and wanting to be expressed through us. So there's a way that we simply allow, and there's the other way, paradoxically also simultaneously true, that we take action in order, we practice these practices in order to make the way. So it brings us all around to tending the temple of self is committing in a devotional way to make ourselves available to those blessing realms that are constantly always ready and eager to express through us. So there's an ease that comes with it. Although we've mapped out so many practices, what your illustration now says to me is like, oh yes, and it's easy and natural and it wants to happen.
So what would we want to say in closing by way of invitation for anybody visiting with us here on Portals or seeing this anywhere else and searching to become activated in themselves about this time, about their possibility, through challenge, through personal struggle, through career struggle, through relational struggle, through navigating in the world struggle, all of those. And I think the message, the invitation is, you potentially are never not in a practice opportunity, every circumstance, every situation, every challenge is a practice opportunity. And where you landed this, Grace, has this ambidextrous nature. So much is indeed allowing the flow of life. You can choose to engage with the cosmology of practices from that end. And then you may choose to go as high resolution in skill building, in capacity building, in expanding your language and metaphor and the whole range of tool set that you may choose to bring, because the more versatile we are, the greater intelligence that can flow through us. And yes, life flows anyway. When I take the devotional sentiment that I want to be in service of life and of the greatest flow of the intelligence that wants to access the opportunities around me through me, that awakens me to what else do I want to reach for in my own development practice? What other spaces do I need to learn to integrate? Where else is there still outage or opportunity in my various theaters of expression, such that I become more versatile? That's for me a way to integrate that ambidextrous nature, that I suppose the tone, the invitation from you to me, the way I internalize it. Aviv, don't forget to relax into the bigger picture. Don't be too industrious or hardworking in the details. Come up for air to allow the bigger picture. So I do that as well. But what would you say by way of parting invitation for anyone to truly engage with the idea of a living practice as the bridge to unlocking a greater participative engagement with life?
Yes. Well, it is what you were alluding to a moment ago. And I would also say life is always calling itself forth into manifestation more and more through us. And so that kind of the big energy behind wanting to be expressed is life's. And that bit of us bringing ourselves into alignment, my individuality into alignment and service of something larger than myself, of life itself, is the part where you've just so masterfully laid out this menu of really powerful ways in. We can open any one of those doors and it will lead to all the other doors. So it's a way that we can just allow ourselves to be attracted to whatever has most resonance for us now. Know that life is the one powering it, and that all I need to do is follow that curiosity and natural lead, and then keep following it, because each door will lead to the others, will show us which ones need to be opened next. So I think what you've done is lay out just an absolutely brilliant, it's not step by step because it's kind of all of it, but it's a menu, and we can allow ourselves to be led to it really naturally.
Thank you, Grace. This last idea you're leaving with us brings me to recognize that what is practice? Practice is opening the door and then walking through the door you just opened. That is what practice is.
That's simple. And just one door at a time. It's just one step at a time, and then the next step, and then the next. And I also want to say practice sometimes evokes that in some of us associations with the word discipline or rigor, and it can feel like, that feels somehow like hard, or I have to make myself do something. But the practice you're talking about, living practice, is motivated by love. It's motivated by devotion to life. It's one of those, meeting with a beloved, you couldn't keep me away. So, this is the heart of our living practice.